blood on my power armor was still wet when I realized everything I'd believed about Roboute Guilliman was a lie. I remember the taste of copper flooding my mouth as I watched my Primarch sign execution orders for his own loyal sons. The scratch of his stylus against parchment drowning out the screams echoing from the interrogation chambers below. My name is Captain Thaddeus Korrath, formerly of the Ultramarines' 4th Company, currently branded traitor by the very legion I served for 2 centuries. They call it the Scouring now, this systematic purge that followed the Heresy's end. But they don't tell you how Guilliman used it to eliminate everyone who knew too much about what really happened during those dark years. You think the Codex Astartes was written to prevent another civil war, but you don't know what I discovered in the sealed archives beneath Macragge. The real horror isn't that half the legions fell to chaos. It's what the loyal Primarchs did to ensure their secrets stayed buried forever. Chapter 1. The Return to Macragge. The fortress of Hera emerged from the warp like a cathedral of ceramite and adamantium, its ancient hull scarred by 7 years of warfare that had torn the galaxy apart and left the Imperium bleeding from wounds that might never properly heal. I stood on the observation deck of the strike cruiser Honor's Edge, watching my Legion's flagship approach the orbital dockyards of Macragge with emotions that had been suppressed for too long. Relief at seeing home again warred with unease about what we might find waiting for us in the aftermath of the Heresy. 7 years. 7 years since the Siege of Terror had ended with Horus's death and the Emperor's ascension to the Golden Throne. 7 years since the surviving traitor legions had fled into the Eye of Terror, leaving behind a fractured Imperium that barely resembled the Golden Age we'd fought to preserve. The Great Scouring had begun immediately, a systematic campaign to hunt down and eliminate every trace of chaos corruption that remained in Imperial space. What none of us understood yet was how that noble purpose would become something far darker than the Heresy itself. Captain Ventanus stood beside me at the viewport, his weathered features reflecting the same mixture of anticipation and apprehension that gnawed at my own thoughts. We'd served together since before Horus had revealed his true nature, fighting side by side through campaigns that had taken us from the Calth system to the very gates of Terror itself. His first company had been instrumental in breaking the Iron Warriors' siege lines around the Imperial Palace, earning honors that should have guaranteed his place in Legion history for millennia to come. Something feels different about Macragge, Ventanus murmured, his enhanced vision detecting details that would escape unaugmented observation. The orbital defenses are more extensive than when we departed. And those ships in the outer system, I don't recognize their configurations. I followed his gaze toward the fleet elements that maintained position beyond the planet's gravitational influence. Vessels whose sleek lines and unfamiliar heraldry suggested they weren't part of the standard Ultramarines battle groups. Their presence raised questions that our initial briefings hadn't addressed, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty that seemed inappropriate for a homecoming celebration. The Vox channel crackled with communications as our convoy received docking instructions from Macragge Orbital Control. Standard protocols, routine authorization codes, nothing that should have triggered the unease that was steadily growing in my enhanced consciousness. Yet something in the controller's tone suggested formality that went beyond military efficiency, as if our return was being treated as an inspection rather than a reunion. Captain Korrath, the ship's communications officer, called from his station. Priority transmission from the fortress of Hera. Lord Guilliman requests your immediate presence in his private study upon docking. You're to come alone and bring any personal records from the Calth campaign. The specificity of that request sent warning signals through my tactical awareness. Guilliman's study was where he conducted the most sensitive business of Legion Command, discussions that required absolute privacy and often dealt with information that could never be officially recorded. Why would he want my personal records from Calth? That campaign had ended in victory, driving the word-bearers from the system after their treacherous surprise attack. What aspects of that conflict required private review years after its conclusion? As our transport approached the fortress of Hera's primary docking bay, I noticed additional security measures that hadn't existed during previous visits. Automated weapon systems tracked our approach with precision that suggested heightened threat protocols were in effect. Guard positions that had once been manned by standard chapter serfs now hosted fully armored Astartes in colors I didn't immediately recognize. Blue and white heraldry that resembled Ultramarines livery, but incorporated symbols that weren't part of our traditional iconography. The docking procedures proceeded with mechanical efficiency, but the absence of the ceremonial elements that usually accompanied a legion's return to its homeworld created an atmosphere of professional distance rather than welcome. No honor guards lined the corridors, no banners celebrated victories achieved during our long campaign. Instead, the ship's passages echoed with the footsteps of sentries who watched our disembarkation with the attention that guards gave to potential threats rather than returning heroes. Captain Ventanus noticed the same anomalies, his expression growing more troubled as we proceeded through corridors that should have felt familiar, but instead carried an undercurrent of tension that made even veteran Astartes uncomfortable. "Brother Captain," he said quietly as we approached the junction where our paths would diverge, "if something is wrong here, the First Company stands ready to support whatever action you deem necessary." His loyalty was absolute, proven through decades of shared warfare, but his words carried implications that neither of us wanted to acknowledge openly. Why would we need to consider action aboard our own Legion's flagship? What circumstances could justify such preparations among brothers who had bled together in defense of the Imperium? The lift that carried me toward Guilliman's private quarters ascended through sections of the ship that I'd rarely visited, passing levels reserved for the most sensitive Legion operations. Each floor revealed glimpses of activities that seemed to involve extensive record-keeping and analysis, with teams of scribes and tech adepts working through mountains of documentation under the supervision of Astartes officers, whose faces I didn't recognize despite my 2 centuries of service with the Legion. Guilliman's study occupied a position near the ship's strategic center, protected by both physical barriers and electronic countermeasures that would prevent any unauthorized surveillance. The guards who flanked its entrance wore the full battle plate of Ultramarines veterans, but their helmet displays showed kill markings and campaign honors that didn't match any operations I could recall from recent years. They acknowledged my approach with nods that contained professional respect, but lacked the familiarity that should have existed between officers of the same Legion. "Captain Korrath," one of them said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling access to the Primarch's presence. "Lord Guilliman is expecting you. You may proceed, but all recording devices and communication equipment must remain here." The security requirement was unusual, but not unprecedented for discussions involving classified information. I surrendered my Vox bead and data slate, retaining only the personal records that Guilliman had specifically requested. The study's doors opened with the whisper of perfectly maintained mechanisms, revealing an interior that had been extensively modified since my last visit. Where once the walls had displayed battle honors and campaign trophies celebrating the Ultramarines' achievements, now they were lined with data terminals and analysis screens showing information that I couldn't immediately identify. Star charts covered regions of space that seemed to include systems throughout Imperial territory, marked with symbols and notations that suggested ongoing operations of some kind. Tehe atmosphere spoke of military planning on a scale that exceeded normal Legion activities. Roboute Guilliman stood with his back to the entrance, studying a holographic display that showed troop movements across multiple sectors simultaneously. His enhanced stature and presence filled the chamber with the aura of authority that had made him one of the most effective Primarch commanders during the Great Crusade and the Heresy. Yet something in his posture suggested tension that went beyond the normal stress of post-war reconstruction. "Captain Korrath," he said without turning around, his voice carrying the perfect diction and controlled emotion that characterized all his communications. "Thank you for responding so promptly. I trust your journey from the Calth system proceeded without incident." "Yes, my lord," I replied, maintaining the formal address that protocol required, despite our long history of more casual interaction. "The Fourth Company completed all assigned objectives and stands ready for new orders." Guilliman turned to face me, and for the first time I noticed changes in his appearance that suggested the toll that recent events had taken on even his superhuman constitution. His eyes held a weariness that hadn't been present before the Siege of Terror, and his expression carried the weight of decisions that had required choosing between competing loyalties and principles. "The assignments you'll receive," he said slowly, "may differ significantly from those you've carried out in the past. The Great Scouring requires operations that go beyond conventional military action. We're hunting an enemy that has learned to hide among the loyal, using our own institutions and traditions to conceal corruption that could destroy the Imperium from within." The implication was clear enough. Chaos infiltration had penetrated Imperial forces more deeply than public knowledge acknowledged, requiring countermeasures that operated according to different rules than conventional warfare. But something in Guilliman's tone suggested that the scope of this threat extended beyond obvious traitor elements to include targets that might surprise even veteran Astartes. "What do you need from me, my lord?" I asked, preparing myself for orders that would likely challenge my understanding of loyalty and duty in ways that the Heresy itself hadn't managed to accomplish. Guilliman gestured toward a chair positioned before his command desk, indicating that our conversation would be more extensive than a simple briefing. "I need your complete honesty about everything you witnessed during the Calth campaign. Not the sanitized version that went into official reports, but the truth about what you saw, heard, and suspected regarding the actions of both loyal and traitor forces." The request seemed reasonable enough on the surface, but the emphasis on honesty implied that previous accounts hadn't been entirely accurate. What aspects of the Calth campaign required additional scrutiny years after its completion? What details had been omitted from official records, and why? "I kept detailed personal logs throughout the campaign," I said, producing the data crystals I'd brought as requested. "Everything I observed and every decision I made is recorded there. But I'm not sure what specific information you're seeking." Guilliman accepted the crystals and inserted them into a reader that immediately began processing their contents. Data streams flowed across multiple displays, showing tactical analyses, casualty reports, and personal observations that I'd recorded during months of brutal warfare against word-bearer forces that had revealed their chaos corruption through acts that still haunted my memory. "Tell me about the civilians," Guilliman said after reviewing several files. "The population centers that survived the initial bombardment. What happened to them during the later phases of the campaign?" The question struck me as oddly specific, focusing on aspects of the war that hadn't been central to military objectives. Most civilian populations had been evacuated or killed during the early stages of the word-bearers' surprise attack, leaving military forces to fight over largely empty territories. But there had been exceptions, isolated communities that had somehow survived the initial destruction and maintained resistance activities throughout the occupation. "We encountered several groups that had organized effective guerrilla operations," I replied, drawing on memories that remained vivid despite the passage of years. "They provided intelligence about traitor movements and assisted with supply operations. Most were eventually relocated to secure areas once we'd cleared their regions of enemy forces." "Relocated," Guilliman repeated, his tone suggesting that the word carried meanings I wasn't grasping. "Do you have records of where these populations were sent?" I searched my memory for details that seemed peripheral to military operations, but had apparently acquired significance I hadn't understood at the time. The evacuation orders came directly from Legion Command. Standard relocation protocols for war-displaced civilians. I assumed they were being transported to refugee centers on secure worlds. Guilliman's expression remained carefully neutral, but something in his eyes suggested that my assumptions had been incorrect. "Captain, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels of Imperial security. The civilian populations you helped relocate were not sent to refugee centers. They were transferred to facilities where they were interrogated, tested, and in many cases eliminated as potential security threats." The revelation struck me like a blow from a power fist, shattering assumptions about the nature of our mission and the fate of people we'd sworn to protect. "My lord, I don't understand. These were loyal Imperial citizens who had resisted chaos corruption. Why would they be treated as threats?" "Because they had been exposed to word-bearer influence for extended periods," Guilliman explained. his voice carrying the weight of decisions that had required abandoning normal moral considerations. Even those who appeared to resist corruption might have been compromised in ways that standard screening couldn't detect. The risk of allowing infected populations to spread throughout Imperial territory was deemed unacceptable. The logic was coldly practical, but it represented a violation of every principle that I'd believed the Ultramarines stood for during 2 centuries of service. We were supposed to protect Imperial citizens, not systematically eliminate them because of theoretical contamination risks. How many, my lord? How many civilians were killed based on these suspicions? Guilliman's pause before answering told me more than his words could convey. Approximately 2 million across all affected systems. The decision was not made lightly, but the alternative was risking chaos corruption spreading to core Imperial worlds. Sometimes the needs of the many require sacrificing the few. 2 million Imperial citizens, eliminated not for actual treachery, but for the possibility that they might have been influenced by forces beyond their control. The number was staggering, representing a level of systematic killing that exceeded many of the atrocities that traitor legions had committed during the Heresy itself. Captain, Guilliman continued, I'm sharing this information because the Great Scouring will require similar decisions on an even larger scale. Chaos corruption has penetrated Imperial institutions more deeply than we initially realized, and conventional approaches to rooting it out have proven insufficient. We need officers who can execute necessary operations regardless of how those operations might appear to outside observers. The implication was clear. He was recruiting me for activities that would involve killing Imperial citizens based on suspicions rather than proof, eliminating potential threats through methods that would violate every oath I'd sworn as an Astartes. The loyal legions were preparing to become the very thing we'd fought against, justifying atrocity through appeals to necessity and the greater good. Standing in that chamber surrounded by evidence of planning that encompassed systematic persecution of Imperial citizens, I felt my understanding of loyalty and duty begin to crumble. The Primarch I'd served with absolute devotion was asking me to become an executioner of innocence, transforming the Great Scouring from a necessary campaign against chaos into something that would make the traitor legion's crimes seem almost modest by comparison. My lord, I said carefully, I need time to consider what you've shared with me. These are not operations I can commit to without understanding their full scope and implications. Guilliman nodded as if he'd expected such a response. Of course, Captain. Take the time you need. But understand that hesitation itself may be viewed as evidence of unreliability. The Imperium's survival depends on absolute loyalty from those entrusted with its protection. As I left his study, my mind reeled with the implications of what I'd learned. The Great Scouring wasn't just about hunting down traitor space marines and chaos cultists. It was about reshaping Imperial civilization through terror and systematic elimination of anyone who might question the new order that was emerging from the Heresy's ashes. The real betrayal wasn't Horus's rebellion against the Emperor. It was what the loyal Primarchs were doing to ensure that no one would ever learn the truth about their own crimes. Chapter 2. The Archives of Shame. Sleep eluded me that night aboard the Fortress of Hera, my enhanced physiology unable to process the cognitive dissonance between my lifetime of loyal service and the revelations that Guilliman had shared in his private study. 2 million Imperial citizens dead, not from enemy action, but from systematic execution by the very forces sworn to protect them. The number echoed through my consciousness like a funeral dirge, demanding answers that I suspected would only lead to more disturbing truths. By 0400 hours ship time, I abandoned any pretense of rest and made my way through corridors that felt alien, despite their familiar architecture. The Fortress of Hera had been my second home for decades. Every passage and chamber mapped in my memory through countless deployments and campaigns. Yet now, the ship seemed transformed into something subtly hostile, populated by personnel whose faces I didn't recognize, and whose duties remained obscure despite my position as a senior captain. My destination was the Librarium Sanctus, the sealed archive complex that housed the Ultramarines' most sensitive records and historical documents. As a captain of the 4th Company, I held access privileges that should have allowed entry to all but the most restricted sections. But the guards who monitored the archive entrance wore the insignia of the Praetors of Orpheus, an elite formation that had been expanded significantly since the Heresy's end. Captain Korrath, the senior guard, acknowledged my approach with professional courtesy that didn't extend to actual recognition. "State your business in the archives." "Research into campaign records from the Calth operation," I replied, using the standard authorization codes that had always granted me unrestricted access. "Personal study in preparation for after-action analysis." The guard consulted his authorization roster with more attention than such a routine request should have required. "I'm sorry, Captain, but access to Calth-related materials has been restricted pending ongoing operational security reviews. You'll need specific authorization from Lord Guilliman's command staff." The restriction was unprecedented in my experience with the archives, suggesting that information about the Calth campaign had acquired sensitivity that it hadn't possessed when the events actually occurred. What aspects of our victory over the word-bearers required such extensive classification? What details were considered too dangerous for even senior officers to review? When were these restrictions implemented? I asked, probing for information that might explain the timing of this new security protocol. "Approximately 3 months ago," the guard replied, his tone suggesting that he'd been expecting such questions. "Part of a general review of all materials relating to contact with traitor forces. Standard procedure for maintaining operational security during the scouring. But I recognized deflection when I heard it, trained by decades of tactical analysis to identify when official explanations didn't account for observed phenomena. Restricting access to historical records suggested active concealment rather than passive security measures. Someone wanted to ensure that specific information remained hidden from scrutiny, even from loyal officers who had participated in the events being classified. I returned to my quarters with more questions than answers, spending the morning hours reviewing my personal logs from the Calth campaign, with new attention to details that had seemed insignificant at the time. The civilian relocations that Guilliman had mentioned appeared throughout my records as routine administrative matters, processed according to standard evacuation protocols that I'd had no reason to question. But reviewing those entries with hindsight revealed troubling patterns that should have triggered investigation if I hadn't been focused entirely on military objectives. The civilian groups were always transported by ships that weren't part of the regular Ultramarines fleet, vessels with unfamiliar markings that arrived precisely on schedule and departed without filing standard navigation reports. The personnel who supervised these operations were never available for consultation about related matters, vanishing from official records as if they'd never existed. Most disturbing of all were the medical screening protocols that had been implemented for all civilian contact. Every Imperial citizen who interacted with our forces was subjected to extensive biological testing that supposedly screened for chaos corruption, but the procedures involved techniques that I'd never encountered during my medical training. Blood samples were analyzed using equipment that operated according to principles beyond standard augury arrays, producing results that were classified immediately upon completion. By midday, I'd identified 17 separate incidents where civilian populations had been subjected to screening procedures that exceeded any reasonable medical necessity. In each case, the results had led to immediate relocation orders that removed these people from any further contact with regular Imperial forces. I had assumed at the time that such measures represented efficient processing of war refugees, but Guilliman's revelations suggested a far more sinister explanation. The implications were staggering. If similar screening and elimination procedures had been implemented throughout all systems affected by Traitor Legion activity, the total number of Imperial citizens killed might exceed Guilliman's estimate by orders of magnitude. The Great Scouring was becoming a campaign of systematic genocide disguised as necessary security measures. I needed corroborating evidence before I could even begin to process the full scope of what was occurring. But my access to official sources had been effectively eliminated. The solution lay in personal contacts throughout the Legion, officers whose loyalty I could trust and whose own records might contain pieces of the larger pattern that was emerging. Captain Ventanus proved to be my most valuable resource, his position with the First Company providing access to operational summaries that covered multiple campaign theatres. When I approached him with carefully framed questions about civilian casualties during recent operations, his expression told me that he'd been wrestling with similar concerns. "Brother Captain," he said after ensuring our conversation couldn't be monitored, "I've been noticing discrepancies in casualty reports that don't align with tactical assessments. Operations that should have resulted in minimal civilian impact are showing population reductions that suggest systematic elimination rather than battlefield losses." His confirmation that the pattern extended beyond my own observations provided additional evidence that something unprecedented was occurring throughout Imperial space. "Have you been able to access detailed records about what's happening to these populations?" Ventanus shook his head grimly. "All information about civilian processing has been classified above my access level, which is unusual for someone in my position. But I have contacts among the logistics personnel who've been noticing supply requisitions that don't match official mission parameters." The supply chain evidence proved to be even more disturbing than the casualty discrepancies. Ventanus had discovered requisitions for medical equipment designed specifically for mass processing of human specimens, including analysis devices that could identify genetic markers associated with psychic sensitivity and biological containers suitable for organ preservation. The quantities suggested operations involving hundreds of thousands of subjects, far exceeding the number of confirmed Chaos cultists who'd been captured during recent campaigns. "There's something else," Ventanus continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper despite our privacy precautions. "The new formations that have been created since the Heresy, the Praetors of Orpheus, the Nemesis chapters, the various specialist units, they're all recruiting from personnel who have no prior connection to the affected civilian populations. It's as if Command wants to ensure that the people carrying out these operations have no personal investment in the targets." The organizational structure he described was exactly what I would expect from a command hierarchy that was planning systematic atrocities while maintaining plausible deniability. By using personnel who had no emotional connection to the victims, Guilliman could ensure that orders would be followed regardless of their moral implications. The loyal legions were being transformed into instruments of oppression that would make the traitor forces seem almost benevolent by comparison. As the day progressed, additional evidence emerged from sources throughout the Legion. Sergeant Mikel of the 7th Company reported unusual deployment orders that had taken his squad to pacify Imperial worlds that showed no signs of actual rebellion or chaos corruption. Chaplain Oriander mentioned conducting funeral rites for civilians who had allegedly died from chaos-related illnesses, but whose remains showed evidence of execution rather than disease. Tech Marine Vorton described maintenance work on medical facilities that were configured for mass processing of human subjects rather than standard healthcare delivery. Each piece of evidence individually could have been explained through routine operational necessities, but the cumulative pattern painted a picture of systematic persecution that operated according to principles that violated every oath we'd sworn as defenders of humanity. The Great Scouring was becoming exactly what its name implied: a thorough cleansing that would eliminate not just chaos corruption, but any witness who might testify to what the loyal forces had done to achieve their victory. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Servitor Tech Epsilon 7, a lobotomized human who maintained the ship's communication networks, had been present during high-level command conferences that were supposed to be completely secure. The servitor's mechanical memory had recorded fragments of conversation that revealed the true scope of what Guilliman and his fellow Primarchs were planning. "Purge protocols confirmed for 17 sectors," one voice had said, during a conference call between multiple Primarchs. "Total population reduction, approximately 40% in affected areas. Genetic screening identifies subjects for preservation, elimination, or enhanced interrogation." "The Emperor's vision requires sacrifice," another voice had replied, recognizable as Rogel Dawn despite the distortion of long-range communication. "Those who cannot adapt to the new reality present unacceptable security risks. Better to eliminate potential threats than risk another civil war." "Agreed," Guilliman's voice had confirmed. The Codex Astartes will formalize these procedures as standard doctrine. Future generations will understand that mercy is a luxury the Imperium cannot afford. The recording was fragmentary and distorted, but it provided confirmation that the systematic elimination of Imperial civilians was not an aberration or emergency measure. It was deliberate policy implemented at the highest levels of Loyalist command. The Primarchs were planning to write mass murder into the fundamental doctrines that would govern Space Marine operations for millennia to come. Standing in my quarters that evening, surrounded by evidence that demolished every assumption I'd held about the nature of loyalty and duty, I faced a choice that would define the remainder of my existence. I could accept what I'd learned and continue serving a legion that had betrayed its most fundamental principles, or I could take action that would almost certainly result in my own death, but might preserve some record of the truth for future generations. The decision came more easily than I'd expected. 2 centuries of service as an Ultramarines captain had taught me that some principles were worth dying for, and the protection of innocent human life was foremost among them. If the loyal legions were planning to institutionalize genocide as standard doctrine, then someone needed to bear witness to what was being done in the Emperor's name. But bearing witness would require evidence that couldn't be dismissed or suppressed, documentation that would survive long enough to reach individuals who could still be trusted with the truth. The archives that had been closed to me officially might still be accessible through methods that didn't require authorization from command personnel who were complicit in the conspiracy I'd uncovered. Techmarine Vorten had described security protocols for sensitive areas aboard the Fortress of Hera, including backup access routes that were maintained for emergency purposes, but rarely monitored during normal operations. The ship's original construction had included redundant systems designed to ensure critical functions could continue even if primary control centers were destroyed, and those redundancies created opportunities for unauthorized access by personnel who understood the underlying architecture. The infiltration would need to be planned with the same precision that I'd applied to combat operations during 2 centuries of warfare, accounting for both electronic surveillance and human monitoring, while allowing enough time to locate and copy the records that would prove what the Ultramarines had become. Failure would result in immediate execution for treason, but success might preserve evidence that could eventually lead to justice for the millions of innocents who were being systematically murdered. As I began planning what would certainly be the most important mission of my career, I felt a strange sense of peace settling over my enhanced consciousness. For the first time since the Heresy began, I would be fighting for something that aligned completely with my original oath as a Space Marine: the protection of innocent human life against all threats, even when those threats wore the armor and carried the banners of supposed allies. The real war was just beginning, and this time I knew exactly who the enemy was. Chapter 3: Into the Heart of Darkness. The maintenance passages of the Fortress of Hera had been designed by architects who understood that even the mightiest warships could become tombs if their vital systems failed during combat. Hidden throughout the vessel's superstructure were emergency routes that allowed critical repairs to continue even when main corridors were breached or blocked, pathways that existed below the level of routine security monitoring because their very secrecy was their primary protection. Techmarine Vorten's schematic data proved invaluable as I navigated through conduits barely wide enough for a fully armored Astartes, my enhanced bulk forcing careful movement through spaces that had never been intended for routine use. The ship's machine spirit seemed to regard my presence with benign indifference, its ancient consciousness focused on maintaining the countless systems that kept 30,000 souls alive in the hostile vacuum of space. My destination lay 17 levels below the main archive complex, where the oldest records of the Ultramarines Legion were stored in crystalline matrices that had preserved information across millennia of warfare and transition. These deepest vaults contained not just tactical records and campaign histories, but the personal logs and private communications of officers whose service predated the current crisis by centuries. The access point Vorten had identified required bypassing 17 different security protocols without triggering alerts that would bring immediate investigation. Each countermeasure demanded specialized knowledge of Imperial technology combined with understanding of the specific modifications that had been made to this particular vessel over its long service history. The process took over 3 hours of painstaking work, but eventually the vault seals responded to my carefully crafted authorization codes. The archive chamber that opened before me contained the accumulated memory of the 13th Legion. Data crystals and written documents arranged in perfect order according to classification systems that had evolved over thousands of years. Everything was here. Deployment records, personnel files, operational assessments, and most importantly for my current purpose, the private communications between senior officers that revealed their actual thoughts about the events they'd witnessed and the orders they'd been given to execute. I began with records from the immediate aftermath of the Heresy, focusing on communications between Guilliman and his subordinate commanders as they'd planned the early phases of the Great Scouring. What I found confirmed my worst fears about the systematic nature of what was being concealed from public knowledge and even from most of the personnel involved in implementing it. The civilian populations present an unprecedented security challenge, Guilliman had written to Captain Thaddeus in a message dated 3 months after the Siege of Terror. Standard screening procedures are inadequate for detecting the subtle forms of corruption that extended exposure to chaos influence can produce. We must assume that any individual who survived in proximity to traitor forces for extended periods has been compromised in ways that conventional analysis cannot detect. The response from Thaddeus revealed the moral struggle that many officers had experienced when confronted with orders that violated their basic understanding of their duty. My lord, the populations in question showed active resistance to chaos corruption throughout the occupation period. Many provided crucial intelligence that allowed our forces to achieve victory. It seems unjust to condemn them for surviving circumstances beyond their control. But Guilliman's reply demonstrated the cold logic that had driven decision-making at the highest levels of command. Justice is a luxury we cannot afford while the Imperium's survival remains uncertain. The risk of allowing corrupted individuals to spread throughout Imperial territory far exceeds any moral considerations about individual innocence. The greater good requires us to err on the side of absolute security rather than misplaced compassion. Similar exchanges appeared throughout the archives, documenting the gradual transformation of the Ultramarines from defenders of humanity into instruments of systematic oppression. Captain after captain had raised objections to orders that violated their fundamental understanding of their mission, only to receive responses that emphasized the necessity of adaptation to post-heresy realities. But the most damning evidence concerned the development of what Guilliman termed enhanced screening protocols that went far beyond simple testing for chaos corruption. These procedures involved detailed analysis of genetic markers, psychological profiles, and social connections that would identify individuals whose backgrounds made them potential security risks regardless of their actual loyalty or contamination status. The screening criteria revealed the true scope of who was being targeted for elimination. Anyone with psychic potential, regardless of whether they'd received proper training or shown signs of corruption. Anyone with technical knowledge that could be used to maintain or repair advanced Imperial technology. Anyone with educational backgrounds that might allow them to question official explanations of events. Anyone with family connections to individuals who'd served in administrative positions during the Heresy. The list went on for pages, encompassing categories so broad that they could be applied to justify eliminating virtually any Imperial citizen who might potentially pose a future threat to established authority. The Great Scouring was being used as cover for a comprehensive purge that would reshape Imperial society by removing anyone capable of independent thought or effective resistance to authoritarian control. Most horrifying of all were the records describing the facilities where these enhanced screenings were being conducted. The documentation referred to them as processing centers, but the specifications made their true nature unmistakable. These were execution facilities designed for mass killing, equipped with medical analysis equipment that could extract valuable biological materials before disposal of the remains. The scale was staggering. 17 major processing centers were operating throughout Imperial space, each capable of handling approximately 50,000 subjects per standard year. The total capacity represented systematic genocide that would eliminate millions of Imperial citizens annually, disguised as necessary security measures that were too classified for public knowledge. As I copied this evidence onto secure data crystals, my hands trembled with rage that my enhanced physiology could barely contain. Every oath I'd sworn as a Space Marine was being violated by the Legion I'd served with absolute loyalty for 2 centuries. The Ultramarines had become something worse than the traitors they'd fought, using the authority of their supposed loyalty to commit atrocities that exceeded even the most extreme Chaos cultists in their systematic cruelty. But the archives contain more than evidence of current crimes. They revealed the historical precedents that had made such atrocities possible. Records from the Great Crusade showed similar patterns of civilian elimination disguised as necessary security measures, suggesting that the systematic oppression of Imperial populations had been standard practice long before the Heresy provided additional justification. The conquest of Monarchia appeared in these deeper archives with details that contradicted every official account I'd ever encountered. The word-bearers hadn't been censured simply for religious devotion that slowed their compliance campaigns. They'd been punished for discovering evidence of civilian processing facilities that predated their legion's supposed corruption. Lorgar's fury at the Emperor hadn't stemmed from wounded pride, but from the realization that the Imperial truth was built on foundations of systematic deception and murder. Similar patterns appeared in records from dozens of other compliance campaigns, showing that civilian populations that resisted Imperial integration weren't simply conquered. They were eliminated through procedures that ensured no witnesses survived to testify about what had actually occurred during the supposedly glorious expansion of human civilization. The heresy itself began to appear in a new light as I reviewed communications between Primarchs who'd apparently been aware of these practices before Horus's rebellion began. Several of the traitor Primarchs had tried to expose or prevent civilian elimination programs, only to be branded as traitors when they'd opposed orders that violated their understanding of what the Great Crusade was supposed to achieve. The Emperor's vision has been corrupted by those who mistake ruthless efficiency for necessary strength. Horus had written in a message to Magnus the Red, dated months before his supposed fall to chaos. "We are becoming the very tyranny that we claim to oppose, destroying the humanity we swore to protect." Magnus's response had been equally damning. "The price of empire appears to be our own souls. I fear that we are creating an imperium that will survive through terror rather than loyalty, maintained by eliminating anyone brave enough to question its methods." These communications painted the heresy in completely different terms than official history suggested. Instead of corruption by chaos powers, the rebellion appeared to have been triggered by moral opposition to systematic atrocities that had been presented as necessary imperial policy. The traitor Primarchs hadn't fallen to darkness. They'd been driven to rebellion by exposure to truths about the Imperium that loyal forces had been willing to accept or ignore. But the most shocking discovery came in the form of personal logs that Guilliman himself had recorded during the early years of the Great Crusade. Entries that revealed his own evolving understanding of what the Emperor actually expected from his sons. The Primarch I'd served with absolute devotion had once been capable of moral revulsion at the systematic elimination of civilian populations, but had gradually accepted such practices as necessary components of imperial expansion. "I begin to understand why Father chose to create us without normal human emotional responses," one entry read. "The decisions required to build and maintain an empire of this scope would destroy any conscience that remained bound by conventional moral considerations. We must become something beyond human if we are to serve humanity's ultimate interests." The transformation documented in these private records was heartbreaking to witness. A gradual erosion of moral principles that had left Guilliman capable of ordering genocide while believing himself to be serving the greater good. The loyal Primarchs hadn't avoided corruption. They'd simply been corrupted by different influences that made them willing servants of systematic oppression rather than agents of obvious chaos. As I completed my copying of the most critical evidence, alarms began sounding throughout the ship's archive sections. My infiltration had been detected, either through security systems I'd failed to bypass, or through monitoring that had tracked my extended absence from normal quarters. Within minutes, security teams would be converging on my position, with orders to detain or eliminate anyone found accessing classified materials without authorization. The exit route I'd planned led through sections of the ship that would normally be lightly guarded, but the alarm conditions would flood every passage with security personnel equipped with sensors that could track Astartes' signatures through any concealment. My only advantage lay in knowledge of the ship's construction that exceeded what most guards would possess, allowing navigation through areas that weren't included in standard patrol routes. The chase through the fortress of Hera's lower levels proved to be the most challenging tactical operation of my career, requiring all the skills I'd developed through 2 centuries of warfare against enemies who possessed every advantage, except detailed knowledge of the terrain. Security teams equipped with the latest Imperial technology pursued me through passages where each wrong turn would result in immediate capture and execution. But I'd planned for this eventuality, preparing drop sites where the copied evidence could be hidden, even if I was captured before reaching safe extraction points. The data crystals that contained proof of the Ultramarines' systematic betrayal of their founding principles were secured in locations that would preserve them, regardless of what happened to me personally. The final stage of my escape required reaching the ship's external hull through emergency airlocks that would allow transfer to a cargo hauler that was scheduled to depart for resupply operations on Macragge itself. If I could reach the planetary surface, there were contacts within the general population who might be able to preserve the evidence long enough for it to eventually reach individuals who could expose the truth. But as I prepared to exit the ship that had been my home for decades of loyal service, I realized that my personal war was just beginning. The evidence I carried would mark me as a traitor to the Legion I'd served with absolute devotion, but it also represented the only hope that future generations might learn the truth about what had been done in the Emperor's name. The real betrayal wasn't Horus's rebellion against Imperial authority. It was what the loyal forces had become in their determination to prevent any future challenge to their vision of order. And now, I was the only witness who remained free to testify about crimes that would reshape the galaxy for millennia to come. Chapter 4. The Underground War begins. Macragge's surface had never looked more beautiful or more alien as I descended through its atmosphere in a stolen transport that bore falsified identification codes and cargo manifests. The world that had shaped my understanding of honor and duty spread below me in all its austere magnificence, but I was no longer approaching it as a loyal son returning home. I was infiltrating enemy territory that happened to be wearing the face of the place I'd been born. The spaceport complex outside Magna Macragge Civitas operated with the mechanical efficiency that characterized all aspects of Ultramarines administration. But even from altitude, I could see modifications that hadn't existed before my departure for the Calth system. New screening facilities processed all incoming personnel through procedures that appeared far more extensive than standard security protocols, while additional storage areas suggested logistics operations on scales that exceeded normal planetary requirements. Landing among the cargo haulers and civilian transports that serviced Macragge's industrial complexes required maintaining the fiction that I was simply another tech specialist returning from assignment with Imperial reconstruction efforts. The forged documentation that I'd prepared during my escape from the fortress of Hera would pass routine inspection, but any detailed scrutiny would reveal discrepancies that would trigger immediate investigation. The customs processing station revealed the first glimpse of how thoroughly Macragge society had been transformed during my absence. Where once the procedures had been conducted by local civilians under light Astartes supervision, now every position was staffed by individuals whose bearing and augmentations suggested military or intelligence backgrounds. These weren't customs officials. They were interrogators trained to identify potential security threats among returning Imperial personnel. Purpose of visit? The screening officer inquired, his enhanced eyes analyzing biometric data that my stolen identity couldn't completely conceal. Enhanced reflexes and bone density modifications marked me as someone with combat augmentations that exceeded civilian specifications. Technical consultation regarding mining equipment optimization, I replied, offering documentation that supported my cover as an industrial specialist with expertise in equipment used throughout the Eastern Fringe. Lord Guilliman's reconstruction initiatives require experienced personnel to maximize resource extraction efficiency. The explanations seemed to satisfy the initial screening, but the follow-up procedures involved medical scans that probed for biological markers I'd never encountered during previous visits to Macragge. Blood samples were analysed through equipment that operated according to principles beyond standard augury arrays, producing results that were transmitted to secure databases for comparison with classification systems I couldn't identify. "Report to Administrative Complex 7 for assignment briefing," the officer finally declared after completing screenings that had taken nearly 2 hours. "Transportation will be provided. Do not deviate from assigned routes or attempt to access restricted areas without proper authorization." The transportation to Administrative Complex 7 carried me through districts of Magna Macragge Civitas that had been substantially modified since my last visit. New construction followed architectural principles that emphasized surveillance and control over the aesthetic considerations that had previously characterized Ultramarines building projects. Guard posts appeared at intervals that suggested military occupation rather than civilian governance. Most disturbing were the population patterns I observed during the journey. The streets that had once bustled with citizens engaged in the countless activities that sustained a thriving world now showed far fewer individuals, and those who remained moved with the careful purposefulness of people who understood that their activities were being monitored continuously. This wasn't the confident society that had produced some of the Imperium's finest warriors. It was a frightened population living under systematic surveillance. Administrative Complex 7 proved to be a facade that concealed operations having nothing to do with industrial consultation. The briefing room where I was directed contained personnel whose equipment and procedures made their true purpose unmistakable. I was being processed as a potential security threat, rather than being assigned to legitimate reconstruction work. "Citizen Korrath," the senior administrator said, using the false identity I'd presented during initial screening. "Your technical background and recent service in affected regions make you a valuable resource for ongoing security assessments. However, certain aspects of your profile require additional verification before assignment to sensitive projects." The additional verification involved interrogation techniques that I recognized from intelligence operations that had been classified far above normal security levels. Neural probes attempted to access memories that I couldn't allow them to examine, while psychological assessments searched for evidence of corruption or unreliability that would mark me as a security risk. But my preparation had included countermeasures developed during decades of resistance operations against enemies who possessed similar capabilities. Mental discipline techniques that were part of standard Astartes training could be adapted to defeat interrogation procedures designed for use against ordinary humans, creating false memory patterns that would satisfy the analysis while concealing actual experiences. The session lasted 6 hours before the interrogators declared themselves satisfied with my reliability assessment. "You will be assigned to Mining Complex Supervision in Sector Quintus," the administrator announced. "Report to Transportation Hub 12 for immediate departure. Your supervisor will provide detailed instructions upon arrival." But I had no intention of reporting to any assignment that would place me under continued surveillance while preventing access to the information I needed to document the scope of what was occurring on Macragge. The data crystals hidden throughout my equipment contained evidence that could expose the truth about the Great Scouring, but that evidence needed to reach individuals who possessed both the capability and the courage to act upon it. The mining complex assignment provided the perfect opportunity to disappear into Macragge's industrial sectors, where the constant movement of personnel and equipment would make individual tracking more difficult. But more importantly, the industrial areas were where I might find contacts among the civilian population who could provide assistance with preserving and distributing the evidence I'd obtained. Brother Sergeant Kellis of the Ultramarines 9th Company had grown up in Sector Quintus before his selection for Space Marine training, and his family connections might provide access to individuals who could be trusted with information that would mark them as traitors if discovered. The risk of compromising innocent civilians was enormous, but the alternative was allowing the systematic genocide to continue without any opposition or documentation. The transportation to Sector Quintus revealed additional evidence of the transformation that Macragge had undergone during the months following the Heresy's end. Checkpoints monitored all movement between districts, while patrol routes ensured that no area remained outside regular surveillance. The civilian population was being managed with the same thoroughness that military commanders applied to controlling occupied territories. But systematic control created opportunities for those who understood its patterns and limitations. The security measures were designed to monitor normal civilian activities, not to detect infiltration by individuals with specialized training in avoiding detection. My knowledge of Imperial security protocols, combined with Astartes' capabilities, gave me advantages that the surveillance systems couldn't account for. The mining complex, where I was supposed to report, proved to be an ideal cover for establishing contact with individuals who might assist with my mission. The facility employed thousands of workers whose backgrounds and family connections spanned the entire planet, creating networks that could potentially reach every level of Macragge society if properly approached. Foreman Axios Kellis possessed the weathered features and augmetic modifications that characterized individuals who'd spent their lives working with dangerous industrial machinery. But his eyes held intelligence that suggested capabilities beyond manual labor. More importantly, his response to subtle inquiries about his brother's service with the 9th Company revealed family pride that hadn't been diminished by recent events. Kellis served the Legion with honor for 40 years before the Heresy, he said during a conversation that appeared to focus on production schedules and equipment maintenance. His last message mentioned duty that required absolute discretion, but nothing that suggested he was facing personal danger. The implication was clear. Brother Sergeant Kellis had been assigned to operations that his family understood were classified, but hadn't been informed about his current status. If he was among the officers who'd been eliminated for knowledge that made them security risks, his family might be willing to assist with preserving evidence that could eventually lead to justice for his death. Some duties require sacrifices that aren't publicly acknowledged, I replied carefully, testing his willingness to discuss sensitive topics. Veterans understand that service sometimes means protecting people who will never know what was done on their behalf. Axios's expression suggested he grasped the deeper meaning of my words. My family has always understood the cost of service. We've also learned to value those who remember what duty actually means, even when official definitions change. The conversation established foundation for more extensive cooperation, but developing actionable trust would require time that I might not possess. Security protocols on Macragge ensured that my false identity would eventually be detected through cross-referencing that would reveal discrepancies in my background documentation. I had perhaps days before my presence would trigger investigation that would expose my real identity and mission. The solution lay in accelerating the timeline for preserving and distributing the evidence I'd obtained while preparing escape routes that would allow me to evade capture long enough to ensure that the information reached individuals capable of acting upon it. The approach required accepting risks that would almost certainly result in my death, but the alternative was allowing the systematic atrocities to continue without any opposition. That evening, working by the light of industrial illuminators that cast harsh shadows through the mining complex, I began the most important mission of my career. The evidence needed to be copied and distributed to multiple recipients who could preserve it independently, ensuring that the truth would survive even if individual copies were discovered and destroyed. The data crystals contained not just documentation of current crimes, but historical records that revealed the systematic nature of Imperial oppression that had been concealed from public knowledge for millennia. This information could provide the foundation for resistance movements that might eventually grow large enough to challenge the authoritarian structure that was emerging from the Heresy's aftermath. But distribution required networks of individuals who possessed both the technical capability to preserve the information and the moral courage to risk their lives to expose crimes committed by the supposedly loyal Imperial forces. Finding such individuals on a world that had been completely infiltrated by Ultramarines intelligence services would require careful assessment of potential recruits. Axios Kellis proved to be more valuable than I'd initially hoped. His position as a mining foreman provided access to communication networks that reached throughout Macragge's industrial sectors, while his family connections included individuals who worked in transportation, data processing, and even governmental administration. More importantly, his brother's service with the Ultramarines had provided him with understanding of military organization that would be crucial for operational security. "The people you're trying to reach," he said, during a carefully orchestrated meeting in maintenance tunnels beneath the mining complex, "they'll need to understand that this isn't about opposing the Emperor or the Imperium. This is about preserving the principles that the Imperium was supposed to represent." His insight demonstrated understanding of the psychological challenges that would face anyone who encountered evidence of systematic betrayal by supposedly loyal forces. The documentation I'd obtained didn't just reveal crimes. It challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of imperial authority and the trustworthiness of institutions that billions of people depended upon for protection and guidance. "The evidence speaks for itself," I replied, offering him access to selected portions of the archived material. "People have the right to know what's being done in their name, even if that knowledge forces them to make difficult choices about their own loyalties." As Axios reviewed the documentation, his expression shifted from skepticism through horror to grim determination. The evidence was overwhelming. No rational individual could examine it and maintain faith in the moral authority of the current imperial leadership. But accepting the truth would require rejecting everything that Macragge society had been built upon. "How many others know about this?" he asked, after completing his initial review of the evidence. "As far as I know, anyone else who discovered what I found has been eliminated as a security risk," I replied honestly. "I may be the only surviving witness to information that could prevent millions more deaths if it reaches the right people." The weight of that responsibility settled over both of us as we began planning for distribution of evidence that would transform the galaxy if it could survive long enough to reach audiences capable of taking action. The real war wasn't being fought against chaos corruption. It was being waged between those who demanded truth and those who would preserve power through any means necessary. And we had just volunteered to fight on the side that was outnumbered by factors that made victory seem impossible. Chapter 5. The Network of Truth. The resistance network that emerged from our initial contact with Axios Kellis grew with the organic precision of a military operation planned by experienced commanders, but executed by civilians whose only qualification was moral courage that exceeded their concern for personal safety. Within 2 weeks of our first meeting, the mining complex had become the operational center for a conspiracy that spanned 17 different industrial sectors across Macragge's primary continent. Each new recruit was approached with the careful deliberation that intelligence operations demanded, but the evidence I'd obtained from the Fortress of Hera's archives made persuasion almost unnecessary. Imperial citizens who had spent their lives believing in the fundamental righteousness of their civilization were confronted with documentation that shattered every assumption they'd held about the nature of the Imperium they served. Mara Vex, a data processor who worked in the planetary communication hub, represented the kind of individual whose cooperation could transform our capabilities exponentially. Her position provided access to transmission networks that reached throughout Imperial space, while her technical expertise could ensure that information was distributed in ways that would be almost impossible to suppress completely. "The screening protocols that have been implemented since the Heresy," she said during a meeting conducted in the industrial tunnels that had become our primary security zone, "they're not just checking for chaos corruption. The analysis procedures are designed to identify individuals whose psychological profiles suggest potential for independent thought or resistance to authority." Her revelation confirmed my suspicions about the systematic nature of the oppression that was being disguised as necessary security measures. The Great Scouring wasn't simply eliminating obvious threats. It was reshaping Imperial society by removing anyone capable of questioning official explanations of events. "How extensive is the screening?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would exceed my worst projections. "Every Imperial citizen is being processed through these evaluations," Mara replied, her voice carrying the professional calm that came from working with devastating information until it became routine. "The procedures are being presented as medical checkups or employment assessments, but they're actually comprehensive psychological and genetic analyses designed to identify targets for elimination." The scope was staggering. If every Imperial citizen was being evaluated for elimination, based on criteria that included independent thinking and technical competence, the total number of potential victims could exceed the entire population of several star systems. The loyal Primarchs were planning systematic genocide that would make the Heresy's casualties seem modest by comparison. But Mara's access to communication networks also provided opportunities for exposing these crimes on scales that could potentially reach billions of people before suppression efforts could prevent distribution. Can you establish transmission protocols that would distribute information faster than security forces could respond to shut them down? Not through standard Imperial networks, she admitted. Those are monitored too closely, and any unauthorized transmission would be detected and traced within minutes. But there are alternative communication methods that operate below the level of official attention. The alternative networks, she described, exploited weaknesses in Imperial communication security that had never been addressed because they hadn't been considered threats by authorities who focused on obvious enemies rather than internal dissent. Civilian networks that had been established for routine commercial and social purposes could be modified to carry data that would appear as innocuous traffic until it reached recipients who possessed the codes necessary to extract the actual information. Meanwhile, other network members were developing capabilities that would support distribution efforts while providing security for participants whose exposure would result in immediate execution. Axios Kellis had recruited mining personnel whose technical expertise could create hidden storage facilities for evidence copies, while family connections throughout Macragge society provided access to individuals who could preserve information indefinitely if necessary. Most critically, we began identifying Imperial personnel whose positions provided access to decision-making processes that could potentially be influenced if they encountered evidence of the systematic crimes being committed by their own leadership. Military officers, administrative officials, and technical specialists who possessed both authority and moral principles might be willing to take action if they understood the scope of what was occurring. The challenge lay in approaching such individuals without triggering security responses that would expose the entire network before it could achieve sufficient size to survive systematic suppression efforts. Each contact required exhaustive background research to ensure that potential recruits weren't intelligence operatives who were monitoring for exactly the kind of resistance activity we were attempting to organize. Captain Marcus Valerius of the Ultramarines' 3rd Company proved to be our most valuable potential contact within the Legion itself, but also the most dangerous to approach directly. His service record showed a pattern of questioning orders that violated established tactical doctrine, suggesting moral principles that might make him receptive to evidence of systematic atrocities. But his position also meant that any approach would be reported through channels that could expose our entire operation. The solution required using intermediaries who could establish contact without revealing the source or scope of the information being offered. Valerius had family connections to civilian populations that had been affected by the Scouring's security measures, creating personal motivations that might override his loyalty to Legion command if he understood what was actually being done to innocent Imperial citizens. His sister works in the agricultural processing centers outside Magna Macragge Civitas, Axios reported, after researching Valerius's background through family networks that operated below the level of official monitoring. She's been asking questions about population reductions in rural districts that are being attributed to disease outbreaks, but don't match standard plague patterns. The approach to Valerius required careful preparation that would allow him to discover evidence gradually, rather than being confronted with information that might trigger psychological defense mechanisms. Military personnel were trained to reject intelligence that contradicted their fundamental assumptions, but they were also taught to investigate anomalies that suggested systematic deception by potential enemies. Through his sister, we began feeding Valerius information that would allow him to reach his own conclusions about what was occurring on Macragge and throughout Imperial space. Agricultural production data that showed population reductions not corresponding to recorded disease casualties. Transportation records that revealed civilian groups being moved to facilities that didn't appear on standard maps. Medical supply requisitions that included equipment designed for mass processing of human subjects rather than standard healthcare delivery. The investigation that Valerius launched in response to these anomalies revealed his character and confirmed our assessment of his reliability. Instead of reporting suspicious patterns to his superiors, he began conducting his own research into activities that official channels wouldn't acknowledge. More importantly, his investigation methods showed understanding of operational security that would be crucial if he decided to take action based on what he discovered. After 3 weeks of careful investigation, Valerius requested a meeting with his sister that we were able to monitor through surveillance equipment that Mara had installed in communication networks throughout the agricultural districts. His questions revealed that he'd reached conclusions about the systematic nature of civilian elimination that aligned with our evidence, but he needed confirmation that his suspicions were accurate rather than paranoid speculation. "The numbers don't add up," he told his sister during a conversation that we recorded for analysis. "The casualties from supposed disease outbreaks exceed anything in Imperial medical records, but the symptoms being described don't match any known plague characteristics. I think people are being eliminated deliberately, but I can't understand why loyal Imperial forces would target their own civilians." His sister's response showed that our information distribution had been effective at the civilian level. "Marcus, there are things happening that aren't being reported through official channels. People are disappearing, who showed no signs of illness or corruption, being taken to facilities that no one ever returns from. It's not disease, it's systematic elimination of anyone who might question what's being done." The exchange continued for over an hour, as Valerius processed information that challenged every assumption he'd held about the nature of his service with the Ultramarines. We watched him struggle with evidence that his own legion was participating in atrocities that violated every principle they'd sworn to uphold, battling psychological defense mechanisms that wanted to reject the truth rather than accept that he'd been complicit in systematic murder. But military discipline that had been trained into his enhanced consciousness for decades eventually overcame emotional resistance to accepting unpleasant realities. "If what you're telling me is accurate, then I need to see proof that would stand up to official scrutiny. Evidence that can't be dismissed as civilian rumor or enemy propaganda." The moment had arrived for direct contact that would either gain us a crucial ally within the Legion hierarchy or expose our entire network to systematic suppression. I made the decision to reveal my identity and offer Valerius access to the complete evidence I'd obtained from the archived records, accepting risks that could destroy everything we'd built if his loyalty to official authority exceeded his commitment to protecting innocent life. The meeting occurred in maintenance tunnels beneath Magna Macragge Civitas, chosen for locations that provided multiple escape routes while offering protection from standard surveillance equipment. Valerius arrived alone as requested, but his bearing and equipment suggested readiness for combat that would be immediate and lethal if he determined that our contact represented a threat to Legion security. "Captain Korrath," he said upon recognizing me despite civilian clothing and basic disguise measures. "According to official reports, you died during the evacuation of Calth when your transport was destroyed by word-bearer raiders. What are you really doing here?" "Trying to prevent the Ultramarines from becoming exactly what we fought against during the Heresy," I replied, offering him access to data crystals that contained the archived evidence. "Everything we believed about the Great Scouring has been a lie designed to conceal systematic genocide that exceeds anything the traitor legions accomplished." The documentation session lasted 6 hours as Valerius reviewed evidence that demolished his understanding of what the Ultramarines had become since the Heresy's end. Unlike civilian recruits who had needed time to process information that contradicted their assumptions, his military training allowed him to analyze the data objectively and reach tactical conclusions based on observed patterns rather than emotional responses. "This isn't aberrant behavior by rogue elements," he concluded after completing his review. "This is systematic policy implemented at the highest levels of Legion command, designed to reshape Imperial society through elimination of anyone capable of effective resistance to authoritarian control." His analysis confirmed what I'd suspected about the ultimate scope of what was being planned. The Great Scouring was being used as cover for comprehensive social engineering that would create an imperium where questioning authority became impossible because anyone with the capability for independent thought had been eliminated. The question, Valerius continued, is whether evidence alone will be sufficient to stop what's occurring, or whether effective resistance will require direct action against Legion personnel who are implementing these policies. The implication was clear. He was prepared to take up arms against his own Legion if that was what stopping the systematic atrocities required. But he also understood that internal resistance would need to achieve sufficient scale to prevent being suppressed before it could accomplish meaningful objectives. I can provide access to other officers who might be willing to act if they understood what was actually occurring, he offered. But we would need operational security that could protect them from retaliation while they decided whether to join active resistance. The network expansion that Valerius enabled transformed our capabilities exponentially, but it also created vulnerabilities that would eventually attract attention from intelligence services that monitored for exactly the kind of organized opposition we were developing. Within days of beginning recruitment among Legion personnel, we detected increased surveillance activity that suggested our security had been compromised at some level. Counterintelligence operations are tracking communication patterns that indicate organized resistance activity, Mara reported during an emergency meeting convened after her monitoring equipment detected systematic analysis of civilian network traffic. They haven't identified specific individuals yet, but they're developing algorithms that will eventually isolate our communication protocols. The revelation forced acceleration of our timeline for distributing evidence before security forces could destroy the network and eliminate everyone who'd been involved in its operations. We had perhaps days before systematic arrests would begin, targeting anyone whose activities suggested potential involvement in resistance activities. But we also had capabilities that hadn't existed when our operation began. The network now included hundreds of individuals whose technical expertise and access to Imperial infrastructure could ensure that evidence would survive and continue spreading even if the original distribution network was destroyed. The final phase of our mission was beginning, and success would determine whether the truth about the Great Scouring's systematic atrocities would survive to influence future generations, or whether it would be buried along with everyone who had tried to preserve it.